Good. Do you want me to do it? Oh, there we go. Sound check. Always fun to hear yourself. Yeah. Yeah. Usually I have to bring my own, so it's, Hello, friends. For the sake of time, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Cheryl Albright, and I'm an occupational therapist and a yoga therapist. And today we're just going to be talking about using basic neurological signs to guide treatment. So a little bit about my background. I have an older brother with autism. I also had an aunt and grandmother with Alzheimer's. My aunt also had Down syndrome. And I've been an occupational therapist for 18 years and have been using yoga within my clinical practice for 12. So we're going to talk a little bit about what soft neurological signs are versus hard. Why do we care about why we're looking at these and the impact that it has on the rehabilitation process. So hard neurological signs. These are things that you can see and measure. So these are your brain scans, your MRIs, your CAT scans, other forms of imaging, x-rays, and measurements, height, weight, head circumference. Anything that you can physically measure falls into this category. Everything else falls into the soft neurological signs. So I want you to think of like a sobriety checkpoint and what they have individuals do during that. This is a VR exercise with the Army and National Guard, but the reason they're looking for that is because it's showing them that the brain is not working the way that it should. Now, in the case of being on a substance like alcohol or drugs, that is temporary for the most part. But for the individuals that I work with, it impacts their ability for sensory processing, motor planning, body control. And so what I'm looking for is when I ask somebody to do something, the body's response to whatever I've just asked. So whether it's stand on one foot, and we're going to go into some of the things that I have my clients go through. So it's not just the actual task that I'm looking for. I'm looking for some other things that go along with it. Are there any extraneous movements? Is there any tremors? Is there anything kind of happening that looks a little wonky? And the nice thing about this is I need to know the diagnosis if I'm billing insurance, because they require it, but otherwise I don't really need to treat a label. And so some of the tasks just kind of look at, if I'm looking at somebody's writing, I'm not usually looking at the quality of the handwriting itself, but I'm looking for any hand tremors, how tightly they're holding a pencil, how hard they're pushing down, things along those lines. So a simple call and response. I say something, and I'm going to ask you to repeat it. So think of all those like kid songs. Anybody go to summer camp, work at a summer camp, their child went to summer camp, right? We sing a phrase with emotion and they respond back with it. That's what we're looking for. We want to see what the response is. Can they actually say the words? Can they do the motor movements? Can they remember what was asked? Can they process the auditory information? And that's all just from one task. Think about the field sobriety checks. What do they have you do? They have you walk heel to toe. Can you walk on a straight line? Can you stand on one foot? Can you stand on one foot with your eyes closed? Why does that matter? Because what I'm looking for is not actually what's actually happening, but can those parts of the brain actually communicate with one another in order to be able to complete a task? So this is kind of how I guide my treatments. I'm looking really at the bottom of that pyramid, which is the central nervous system. That's your brain and your spinal cord. Up at the top, we can take off academic learning and substitute it for executive functioning. But the thing is, if there's something wrong with the nervous system, it doesn't matter what part, there's going to be some issues going up the pyramid. This is actually really old, and we're going to get to kind of a newer development too. But so if we think of the case, we're at a disability conference, right? So if we think of autism as an issue within the brain. Parts of the brain cluster, they don't map out the way they should, so sometimes we see issues with sensory processing. We might see some motor planning issues. There's almost always some kind of language issue, whether it's pragmatic, actually being able to express themselves, any number of things, activities of daily living, and then at the top we're talking about judgment, ability to plan your time, things like that. Same thing can go for a stroke, right? Something happened within the nervous system, and then we have issues going on up the pyramid. This all making sense? So traumatic brain injury.
I think I'll leave this up here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not a problem. So it could be a traumatic brain injury. You still have the same kind of issues kind of going up the pyramid. So there can be a plethora of things. Not everything will be impaired, but just know that that's kind of like that layer approach of, okay, now what, right? So if we take it a step further, the brain and the spinal cord, so what is the brain, the bottom of the brain really responsible for? And that's to make sure your breathing, your heart rate, your wake-sleep cycles, your digestion, all of the lower brainstem functions start there. Well, if there's an issue there, same thing, on up the layers. It's going to be really hard to access that frontal, like up here. I'm always pointing to the front of my head with my clients, but like it's really hard to bring it up here if back here is not working. So fight, flight, freeze falls into that central nervous system because it gets to a certain part of the brain and then you can't access the rest of it. So those that drove here on I-4, we're going to use that as an example because I know yesterday was completely nuts. What happens? You get really worked up. You get startled when some fool drives by you really fast and sets off that fight, flight, freeze. There's a number of things that happen. But that's temporary, right? So some of our individuals, at least that I work with, get stuck in that fight, flight, freeze cycle a lot. And so it's really hard to get past that. My counterparts will say, well, we need to work on the sensory system. I like to take it a step back. Our training said if you did a tactile, vestibular, or proprioceptive activity, that you should get an adapted response. And they're not wrong. I just go, okay, so how can we actually calm the nervous system back down once we get into that phase? So think of the last time you were upset. You're not thinking clearly. Your breathing patterns change. You're not able to take in things that people are saying. Our individuals are no different. So impact on learning, and this also can be used kind of in the reverse. So I'm going to go back. Could be used in reverse. So in the case of like Alzheimer's or some of the vascular dementias and things, it starts in the frontal lobe and kind of recedes backwards. And so the same could be argued here is that, well, maybe those areas aren't being fired together and wired together for a reason, whether it's blood supply, disease process such as the plaques for Alzheimer's, but then things start to recede backwards. So you start to see, at least, and I know in my case, you start to go, their judgment's a little off. Maybe their personality changes a little bit. Things just seem off-putting, but they're still functioning. They're still able to do their ADLs, they're still able to cook, clean, but something's not quite right. And those are kind of your first red flags. So you can use that in reverse as well through the aging process. We're going to talk a little bit about trauma. I've done presentations here in the past about trauma and its impact on development. If it happens young enough, trauma actually stops the brain from developing. And what I was saying about your brain only processing things to a certain point, the temporal lobe on up goes kind of offline. So if you think about it, your brain processes from here down, and it gets stuck in this loop, and you can't get to the frontal lobe where you can actually make a good judgment or have more control. So the temporal lobe is involved with a lot of like visual spatial. So people with like PTSD will tell you that, things don't even look right in space. And so here's why. Nerves that fire together will wire together. When we're talking about the case of developmental disabilities, sometimes they have to fire together a lot for it to stick. Same thing goes for like a stroke. So if something has been physically like blocked off, then you have to recreate pathways in order for your brain to actually start to function again the way it's supposed to. And depending on when the trauma happened, or if it was consistently over time, the brain actually doesn't grow the way it's supposed to. So it's actually smaller in stature. Real quick, I could do a whole hour on just these 2 slides alone. But the biggest difference between like trauma and autism is actually something that happens in the brain. Doesn't mean they can't coincide with one another, but what ends up happening is the temporal lobe kind of goes offline. Whereas autism, the brain actually doesn't map itself out the way it's supposed to. That's where you get those stereotypical behaviors and having to repeat things over and over again. It gets stuck in this like feedback loop. Whereas trauma ends up being this chronic state of fight or flight, and yes, it's still a feedback loop, but it can't get past a certain part of the brain. So 2 different things happen. Also with autism, in a lot of the research they found was during autopsy research, and the brain is actually heavier and more dense, whereas trauma, it's physically smaller and not as strong in certain points. I know this stuff's really dry. We'll get to the fun stuff in a minute. But fight, flight, freeze. How close is that lion? So let's go back to the example on like I-4. How close was your lion? It could be in the car with you, or we can keep it at bay. So if we stop and think about, I use this cartoon as kind of a joke, but the thing is, like, how close is that lion? So think about a day, maybe you didn't sleep so well. You're kind of edgy, right? You're not processing things the way you're supposed to. Lights seem brighter than they really are. And this can go a lot with the chronic fatigue as well. So you're more apt to like snap quickly, right? It's not like you're able to stop and process and think clearly. So it's the same thing, and it's no different with our friends that have developmental disabilities. A lot of times there are some sleep disturbances, so keep that in mind, that that's not helping the whole situation either. Fight, flight, freeze, parasympathetic versus sympathetic. So we want rest and digest, and we don't want fight and flight. And the vagus, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, but the vagus nerve goes to every single vital organ. So if you're in a chronic state of fight or flight all the time, let's think about this for a minute. We might have issues with digestion, being able to urinate and completely empty our bladder because we don't feel the need to, because you don't need that to survive. Anything below the diaphragm, you don't need to actually survive in that flight or flight stage. Anything above, we've got increased heart rate, we have decreased lung capacity, and the sluggish digestion. Lights may seem brighter than they should because the pupils are dilated because they're ready to run. So there's a plethora of things going on all at the same time. I know this stuff's really dry. So we're going to talk about some case examples in how using this kind of bottom-up approach can really be helpful. So trauma, I didn't want to put an individual photo on here just for the sake of privacy, but pre and post trauma care. So individual experienced a lot of complex trauma from death of a parent, being sexually assaulted, grandparent passing, all within like a 3-year period. And so that has a complete impact. Development stopped at the first concern that happened. So what are we going to do with that? And that's a completely different approach than jumping, swinging, and all those fun things that you see in an OT clinic. Has to be dealt with slightly different. So you're talking about elevated heart rates, not being able to sleep, PTSD like a war veteran. Like there's a lot of things going on. So those things that you would do is it takes a little bit more of a finesse. But also impacts physically. A lot of times I see this posture because they want to close off, which is not helping the ability to breathe because your lungs need to be able to expand. This particular student came to me with diagnoses of ADHD, ODD, SPD, like alphabet soup. And so that was kind of my big red flag that something else was probably going on. So here are some of my friends on the spectrum. And so using kind of this bottom-up yoga-based approach, they have learned a plethora of different things. So a friend who can, is got a really weak core is now lifting himself up. He was very proud of himself. But helps increase strength and endurance, decrease behaviors, decrease that fight or flight response. We don't explode as often. Transitions become easier. The one student up at the top, mom came to me because she didn't know what to do. She had banged her head so hard at school that she gave herself a concussion. And so had to go to the emergency room. And so we knew we needed to do something to decrease some of those behaviors. And a lot of, yes, I'm stretching there because there's some orthopedic issues too, but decreasing that fight or flight response was key. And after about 3 months, those behaviors kind of stopped. Mom took over and found a class closer to them and was able to integrate back into the community. Groups are great. One of the groups that we had, it was in a school up in New York. They were tracking their behavior, and it was 30 minutes every week that they weren't running their behavior programs. At the time, restraint and seclusion was still legal. It's not anymore, and as of July 1, it's not legal here anymore either. But they didn't have to run their behavior plans, which was awesome. So working on breathing, working on slowing the heart rate down, working on decreasing those fight, flight, freeze behaviors, which is kind of the underlying cause of some of this explosion, really helped. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. Once again, wanted to leave pictures of actual students. But when I did traveling therapy for a long time, and I did an assignment up in Alaska. I think this room is cold. I'm not going back. So,
This room is cold.
Thank you. Like my hands are imagine the Raynaud's in Alaska. So I had a student that came to me who was 12, and she wasn't doing any of her bathing, dressing, grooming, ADL type care on her own. And the foster parent, first red flag, was like, I don't understand why she's not independent. She's 12, like she should be able to do these things. I said, okay, well, let's figure this out. And so if I would have taken the traditional OT approach of doing the, tactile, proprioceptive, and vestibular activities, AKA some kind of tactile bin, swing, and jumping, it wouldn't have helped. Her heart rate was at like 120 at rest. So it's like she was out running a marathon on a daily basis. You can't learn when you're in that kind of state. So she never learned how to sequence tasks, and that was the biggest issue. So once we got her heart rate a little bit more under control and not all these crazy spikes and dips, we actually were able to teach some sequencing skills. And it was interesting that I got the school district involved. Like, she would go down to the nurse's office so many times a day to get her heart rate taken with a pulse ox. It actually ended up being a really awesome community that rallied around her. And we were able to start building on some of those skills. But she definitely presented like she had a brain injury, which fetal alcohol kind of is. And you'd hand her a comb, and she could tell you it was a comb, and she could tell you that it was to comb her hair, but she couldn't figure out how to make that happen. And so, girls at 12 want to be able to do their hair. It's like a thing, right? And so she was getting really frustrated. And so that helped as well. Some of my friends that I work with now that have FASD, it's complex trauma too, right? So they've been adopted, they've been removed from their biological parents, so I call it plus plus. They've got extra layers. It's like the club sandwich versus just a regular sandwich. There's just so many layers in there that you have to address as the pendulum swings, like, okay, now we're ready to process this, and then we can keep moving forward. It just adds layers and changes. I call it the Swiss cheese, but you never know where the holes are going to be on any particular day. That is the hard part with that. Cerebral palsy. So here are some of my favorite adults. The one gentleman had this ringing motion that he could not stop. It was this involuntary. So going back to those things that I look for, tremors and atypical motor movements, and he had some other kind of range of motion issues too, but it was the first time I could get him to stop doing those movements and he could actually be still. The only other time he could do that was when he was sleeping. And so he was very happy that he could just stop his body from doing something so that he could actually learn a different movement pattern. He could talk better because his body wasn't going into this, all motor movement pattern. My friend Kelly was a little bit more ambulatory. Her PT was more than thrilled. She took a lot less assistance to do transfers. I could get her up and off the floor independently without having the use of another person. Just her movements and general, and as some of these folks age, they age just like the rest of us, but arthritis tends to sit in a little sooner because of the lack of movement and lack of weight bearing. And so, they're in a lot of pain too. So if we can help control some of that, that's always a good thing. I'm way ahead of schedule. So traumatic she was a noxic brain injury, but brain injuries. This little lady, when I met her, she dropped a sudden cardiac arrest. She had a genetic condition that the parents now know, but at the time did not know that she had, and went 10 minutes without oxygen and survived. So the beginning is her in early intervention. So it was all hands-on. She had no control over her body. She had no control over her motor movements. And so now she started, so that middle picture, or that last picture at the top, she's starting to move around by herself. She's starting to sit up by herself, and now she's standing up, bending over, giving the dog a treat. So the power of being able to tackle some of that stuff, her breathing was, as you can imagine, after going 10 minutes without oxygen, was not great. Her breathing patterns were completely off. And so we were able to kind of work through some of that. And she's up in New York, so I don't get to see her that often, but she'll pull out her own yoga mat and go to town, so that's fun. But yeah, she's doing a lot better now. So I'm gonna leave I like to interact with my audience, and I know a lot of people have masks on, but Does anybody have any questions? And I will repeat them because of the mic. Yes.
And this, the gentleman with the CP, how did you get this to stop?
So I've got my hand about where his diaphragm is. And so we did a lot of working on keeping his mouth closed and breathing. And so being able to increase, so breath helps increase circulation, right? And so the more he was able to increase his circulation, the more we could get him to stretch, and the more his body just came to relax. So in this case, it's a little bit different, right? So this happened somewhere either in utero, birthing process, somewhere in that time frame. And so now he's 50s plus. And so the reason I was called in is because he was in a lot of pain. Like if you look at his wrists, and they were still doing that writhing movement at the same time. And so he was just like, I hurt. I hurt everywhere. And so to try to decrease narcotic use, they called me in. So he was able to start relaxing his body a little bit more. And a lot of his therapy sessions were just breathing. So you see my hand right here. I'm just trying to stimulate the diaphragm. That's all I'm doing. So can we get you to breathe just a little bit better? Instead of, a lot of times you'll hear with these individuals, and now I'm banging the microphone. You'll hear kind of as they're trying to breathe, it's almost like they breathe so shallow you hear a gasping kind of noise. So they're trying to communicate, but they can't get a full lung of air to project their voice out. And so that's just kind of where we started. We just started with the breath, and it worked for him. So my case studies are very, very case specific.
I have a question about seizures, because it always seems that, I mean, would you label a seizure as a trauma?
No, I mean, it depends the cause of the seizure. I would call it like a mini brain, it can be like a mini brain injury depending on the severity of the seizure.
But when they have them, I mean, because they always, it's like there's always some aggression after the seizure, so, you know, so
Fight, flight, it depends. So a seizure is, a misfiring of the electrical circuits in your brain, right? And so it goes temporarily offline, but when we come back, it's almost like starting over, depending on how long the seizure was, how much damage the seizure caused. If somebody hit their head hard enough, there could be a mild concussion in there too. So it just depends on who, how, what, like there's so many different factors. Individuals that I work with sometimes, if the seizure is bad enough, it's like starting over. And then we almost have to rebuild all those skills all over again, in hopes that they don't have one. There is some research starting to come out about using some of the yoga breathing techniques to keep seizures at bay, but it has to be done very carefully and with somebody that knows what they're doing, because you don't want to send too much oxygen or too much blood up there, because that would cause one. I've got hands everywhere. Yes?
How do you find someone like yourself? Because all my years I've always had like an occupational therapist. They don't delve into the neurological aspect. So how do you search for a person like yourself with that knowledge?
So the question was, how do you find a therapist that maybe is knowledgeable in neurological processing, and how do you go about doing that? Sometimes they'll advertise. It depends on the clinic. It depends. On my end, I call it yoga. Sometimes if you can find somebody that's trained in some of those techniques, they are aware. I would just make sure that the person is a therapist and yoga, not just a regular yoga teacher. No offense to any of them. It's a different skill set. The other thing, sometimes physical therapists delve into this more than the OTs. I'm just kind of a science nerd, and so that's just how I ended up into it. But calling and ask, do you have?
You travel, do you still do that, or are you based out of a certain city now?
So right now I live in Bradenton, which is Manatee County, and I cover Sarasota, Manatee, Hillsborough, and Pinellas. I've got some teachers kind of around, and therapists. But telehealth now has become widely available, so technically I do cover the whole state. Yeah. Yes, and as of right now, Medicaid is still paying for telehealth.
Have you used some of your techniques of brachiation and neuroplasticity on these children?
The question, I'm gonna have you repeat it one more time.
Have you utilized any types of techniques of brachiation and neuroplasticity to increase more oxygen and exercises to the nervous system?
Yes, so the question, I just do it through a yoga-based approach. The question is, how am I using neuroplasticity? Yeah, so one of my references in here is, there's a bunch of them with the polyvagal theory, but also with why zebras don't get ulcers. The why zebras don't get ulcers, matched with, Dr. Deutsch wrote a great book about the brain that changes itself, and how that's where I get the nerves that fire together, wire together. And so it depends on what pathways you want to strengthen.
You should use the approach of the Institute for the Achievement of Human Potential with Dr. Glenn Dolan and Dr. Carl Delicata, which have been doing this for over 70 years. And it's a way of using what we call patterning, doing cross dominance with the nervous system itself, right hand to left foot. To find that rolling, crawling, and creeping will enhance a lot of the brain dysfunction.
Yes, agreed. Slightly different approach, but same idea. Mm-hmm. Can you say the name one more time? The name of the doctor that you just referenced? The name of the doctor you just referenced?
Dr. Glenn Doman and Dr. Carl Delicata. They're deceased, but their daughter, Dr. Glenn Doman's daughter, Janet Doman, now runs the Institute for the Achievement of Human Potential in Windward, PA.
The Achievement of Human Potential. I'm just repeating what you're saying because I'm mic'd.
She's an anthropologist.
Oh.
She's a colleague of mine. And we
Oh.
both work with children like this.
Okay. Yeah, grab my card. I'd love to have a chat. I see a hand in the back. Yes.
You mentioned a temporal lobe in one of your slides. What were you talking about with that? That was talking about, I think, Alzheimer's or something, or I can't remember what you were talking about temporal lobe. Because I know they have, they talk about the temporal lobe, sometimes they talk about seizures or that.
Yeah, so the question was asking about the temporal lobe for those that can't hear it. I'm repeating the questions because it's getting recorded and I'm mic'd and they're not going to pick up your voice. So that's why I'm doing that. Okay, so temporal lobe so there was a slide on how trauma affects neurological processing. And so I don't have a picture of the brain up there and I have to stay within a certain point for my AV guy, but so what ends up happening is that fight-flight system, it stays in this kind of circuit pattern. So the temporal lobe and higher, so that's the sides of your brain and up, go offline. In the case of seizures, that can happen too, but in this slide, I'm just referring to trauma and trauma-based intervention. So this is, brain scan of a child, but this could be a soldier. The same brain mechanisms go off. So the limbic system that's in control of that fight or flight, the amygdala, and all those pathways get stronger as it goes over and over and over again. So then the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe kind of go offline and don't work the way that they should. So that's why you're seeing kind of that black area. That means it's not firing. The reason the front is still firing is the occipital nerve does have a connection in the brain stem. You need it for fight or flight. And it goes to the perioctal gray, if you want to get real crazy and scientific, but it goes to the brainstem and it causes, because pupils dilate, it causes the pupils to dilate. You need more light to come in to fight off whatever's happening. And that fight off could be accumulation of a lot of things. It doesn't necessarily have to be like something bad happened to you, or you were in an accident, or whatever.
Two questions for FASD.
Yep.
What is the easiest, simplest thing you can do for a child that has it? The second question is, how can you lower, besides breathing, your parasympathetic nervous system, like to get out of the fight or flight?
Sing is my favorite thing. So the two-part question, she said with FAS, how can we get these folks out of the fight or flight other than just breathing? I would look into the yoga breathing exercises because they're a little specific, yogic breathing exercises. If you get a copy of my slides, there's an article that'll lead you to it, or you can go to pranascience.com, and there's a guy that talks about his research with it. Specific exercises that help. Humming and singing, or if they're kids, are the best way. So let's think about the last time you were in a bad mood. And your favorite song comes on the radio and changes your mood. And so, once again, the whole nerves that fire together will wire together. And I would suggest any kind of singing, music therapy is great. The other thing they found, especially with like complex trauma in FAS, is equine therapy, like the rhythm of the horse does something to the nervous system that helps with that as well. There's some great programs all over the state, and you can kind of go from there. And the first part of your question, you said more of the parasympathetic. So yeah, if they'll tolerate something like a guided meditation, I mean, there's a million apps out there. You can get them for free on YouTube. I don't know the age of the individual you're talking about. Okay, no, that's helpful. So a CD I use a lot, they're not CDs anymore, but they're MP3s or whatever, but Chill Children is a good one. But there's a couple different, if you just find one that's for kids, that's guided, if they'll tolerate it, and starting with something that's maybe 2 minutes long and then building up tolerance. I mean, most of my neurotypical adults can't stay still in a yoga class for 10 minutes during relaxation. So trying to start with something really short, or make it into a game. Like, I want to see how long you can hold your body still. We're going to freeze like a statue, and maybe even start that in standing, so it's not as threatening as laying down, right? Because then they have to stop. So my next question is going to be, is there sleep issues? Is there digestion issues? Is there, I'm seeing ahead.
Sleep issues, she has FASD, ADHD, cerebral palsy, Cobb-Shire syndrome a lot. She actually goes to school with Manatee Star Service, I'm going to call you.
Awesome. So yeah, what I would do, we've got to get her sleeping.
Yeah, she does with clonidine now. She gets her full amount of sleep.
Awesome. Awesome. Yes. So I always say tackle the medical first, and then we'll tackle the rest later. So if we can get them sleeping, eating a somewhat balanced diet, and digesting food, those systems have to be in play too. Chronic fight or flight can cause havoc on all of that. So what do we do when we haven't slept? We go for caffeine and carbs, right? Starbucks is great. So they're no different, but they just don't have those coping skills yet. So that's why you get some of this picky eating too. It's like, well, I want carbs, I need carbs, I need carbs, I need to keep going. And you'll find one of two things. Kids who eat very little because they're constantly secreting glucose in that fight or flight, or you have them chronically obese because they're constantly doing that and they're feeding that system with a bunch of sugars and carbs. So It's usually one extreme or the other. I have some very tiny friends and I have some larger friends. And that's usually what it stems from. But yes, there's a lot going on. But tackle medical first, because that will change, because our behaviors change, right? We're no different. So we don't get a good night's sleep, we're cranky. They don't get a good night's sleep, they display behaviors. Like, it's the same thing whether they can talk or not. They're just doing the same thing. And so if we can remember what's typical, I'm using that in quotes, then we can kind of empathize with it too, right? So we've had a bad night's sleep. We want caffeine. We want carbs. We want things that are going to keep us going. They're no different, and when they don't get them, sometimes we have meltdowns. That's just how it goes. I saw a hand up in the back, I think. I thought I saw, okay, I wasn't crazy. All right.
How long does it usually take? So can you give us an idea of when you're implementing this, how long it usually takes for your clients to start to calm down?
Okay, so the question is, how long does it take? Well, every person is different, so I'm going to go back to the autism. So the young lady that's in a plank position, it took us 3 years to get there. Okay, so when I met her, she couldn't cross midline, right? So half of your body could not cross. So she wasn't able to do her activities of daily living, bathing, particularly bathing and dressing, independently. Because you can't, how can you if you can't cross over, right? I would say that kind of came on, the dressing came on about a year later. So this is not a quick process. This is not anything that happens overnight. I'm not a quick fix. I'm not a pill. I'm not so the goal would be, it depends on what your goals are. And it depends on how much neurological involvement there is, right? So, I mean, this is in the case of like autism, and sometimes we need it repeated over and over and over and over again to see change. And so, implementing stuff at home is kind of key. And anything that I'm doing with any of my students' parents, you can do it too. You might feel better. Like, that's the bonus of it, right? Like, do it together. Model what you want them to see. And so, it really just depends on the diagnosis. The gentleman with CP, I'm never going to make him walk. I know this. I'm not going to change his diagnosis. But if I can make him a little bit more comfortable in the body that he was given, then I've done my job. So it's setting those expectations. I'm not going to fix anything, but if I can empower the individual and empower the body to function a little bit better, then I'm good. But I'm not going to fix anything. Yes?
Don't hate me for going here.
Go ahead.
So looking at COVID
Yes.
as a possible trauma
Yes.
in light of pre-existing conditions such as autism,
Correct.
where do you even start with that? How often do you do yogic breathing? Do you do it multiple times a day? Do you start with once a week? How would you approach that from the outside looking in?
So the question was regarding COVID as trauma and how to kind of tackle some of this. It depends on, so my next question to you then is trauma how? Like trauma from lack of routine, trauma from social isolation. Okay. Oof. Yeah. Okay. That's a tough one. So the first thing I tackled is the group that's on the floor. We went straight to online almost immediately so they could still see each other. It was the goal. So we just called it Mindful Monday. We're still going to get together at the end. You guys can talk. We can stay on for an extra 10 minutes so you guys get your socialization. It's kind of how I tackled that. So our friends that maybe have limited language use, that was a little bit more challenging because they're not doing the back and forth, right? So they're not seeing their therapists, they're not seeing their teachers, they're not seeing their support systems. And so that made it a little bit more challenging. Me personally, the second that the risks outweighed the benefits, I was back in somebody's home. So last year, let's say beginning of May, when vaccines rolled out and I got clearance from my doctor, I was fully vaccinated. So, you know, when the risk, for some families, they would have rather dealt with COVID than the lack of routine. So that's an individual decision. If you can get even 2 people together, like it's almost like starting over. So I was listening to a podcast the other day and they were talking about like having to reteach social skills and almost teach social skills in a different way now because now we have technology, right? And so, I mean, even with when my brother was still in New York and I was down here, we would still FaceTime. He doesn't talk. But I would still talk like, hey, like I'm coming to get you. I'm getting you out of the snow, like, and it's gonna be a good time. And like, I still did those things even though he didn't talk or doesn't use verbal language. He has some signs, but he doesn't speak like I'm speaking to you.
Can I follow it?
Yep.
Okay, so Zoom and increased virtual is in place to try to, add in that social. Much more structure is in place, but that fight or flight, that constant emotional overload, and of course, like you said, lack of sleep, picky eating, it all comes back. So we've seen, as far as the emotional and the ability to grab those coping skills that are in his toolbox, he's gone from 5 years worth of work, we're seeing behaviors come back that he had at 3 years of age. So trying to reverse that fight or flight.
Yes. So, a couple things. Getting on the most consistent routine humanly possible. So, I'll give you an example. I went and got my brother last year in March. APD told me it would take me 2 weeks to get him into a facility. It only took 5, but still. So I ripped him from his routine, his group home, threw him on a plane, and rolled dice, crossed fingers that everything was going to work out. What I noticed with him is he'd go to his iPad and hit work. Like, I want to go do something. Like, work. I was like, buddy, there's no day program. I had it all lined up for a temporary until I found his group home, but we didn't have anything. I hired a caregiver, and the first thing we did is we got him on a routine. You get up, you shower, we're gonna go for a walk. After the walk, we're gonna go for a ride. What he started doing is demanding my baking skills. Thank you, like 40 pounds later. And would pull out a cookbook, pick out what he wanted. So then we had a local, to people that know what Detweilers is, had a drive up. So then he was responsible for going to get it with the caregiver and bringing things in. So like the thing that we tried to do is establish some kind of routine. So every day was somewhat predictable, which helps decrease some of that fight or flight. So it depends on the interest of your child. Is there, like, do we like music? Do we like dance? Do we like movement? Can we take walks? There's so many different things that we could do. I just don't know enough about the individual to make it individualized. Not all my friends like yoga. They don't. We come up with different ways to get it. And so then when we start working on yoga off the mat, like you've learned all these skills, it's not just for this rectangle. It's for out here. So now what? So we take those activities that we know decreases your heart rate, and we build them into your day, whether it's singing or dancing, or most of them use music in some form or another. So do we transition from me to a music therapist? Do we, what can we incorporate throughout your day? And sometimes it's not me. So who can I refer out to that may be a better fit? I'm not afraid to do that. Not all my colleagues will do that, but if I'm not the best service for you, I'm going to send you somewhere else. Because I'm not for everybody. I know that. So routines, what they like to do, hone in on what they're good at, and see if that kind of helps settle the system down. I know everybody is this is so weird to be live in person. I haven't done this in a year and a half. So, it's the same thing. It's like, oh yeah, I have a live audience. It's not pre-recorded. This is very strange. But but if I'm feeling those things, what are everybody, like when they had to go back to school, we're back to school, but I can't touch you and you have to wear a mask and you have, that still is not back to normal, or whatever we're going to call it these days. So I hope that helped.
What are some observable behaviors that you might notice a child or person isn't coming out of that thyroid fight?
Okay, so the question was, what are some observable behaviors that I might be looking for when, so my clinical signs usually are, I don't even do sensory processing measures anymore, because I do want to take it a step further. So I'm going to ask you how their sleep is. I'm going to ask you how their diet is. I'm going to ask you what digestion looks like. Are they chronically constipated? And then from there, I look for red face, red ears, dilated pupils. Are they complaining it's too bright in the room? Am I hearing a lot of, if I say something, huh, what? Are they processing sound?
What about in the case of someone with very minimal both receptive and expressive language?
So the question was, what about somebody with limited language? So then I'm looking at, can they even imitate or follow what I'm saying? So can you stand on one foot? Can you, and you're saying no. Never had much receptive language. Okay. So then I'm looking, because a lot of them are demonstration based too. So can you, even if you can't follow my auditory command and all they're hearing is want, 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 can they imitate what I'm doing? So even if it's an attempt or an approximation, or can they even stay focused on me, period? Or are their eyes bing-bonging all over the place? Right? So a lot of those, they're like ping pong balls. You see ding, 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 ding. It's hyper vigilance. They need to know what's going on around them. That's probably where I'd start. Hey, let's find something you can attend to, and then we'll work from there. And I'm always one, if I'm going to guide somebody through a movement pattern, I'm going to touch your hand, wait, hold out mine, and wait for it to be okay. That may take 5 minutes. That's okay. But taking that time, like I'm not going to force anybody through anything. I'm going to take my time, and that's why somebody was asking about timelines. It's going to take me a while. And I believe connection is key. And if I can't build that connection with me or one of my assistants, then we got to find somebody that can make that connection. Because they have to feel safe, that I'm not going to do any harm, or I'm not going to, I'm going to go at their speed. I had an individual, I want to say he was like 20 or 21 on the autism spectrum, and it would take us 5 minutes to get through like one thing. Because I would say what we're going to do. If I didn't get a response, I would then demonstrate what we were going to do. And then I would hold out my hands and wait for him to be ready for me to guide him through what I wanted him to do. And by the time we got through all of that, it could have been 5 minutes. But I'm going to wait, because what am I going to do? I'm going to set him off if he's not prepared for what I'm asking. which is kind of my beef with ABA, but that's a different lecture for a different day. I'm just going to wait. I'm going to sit and wait, and we're going to wait together. Like, I am a good person in your life, and I am just here to help you. So it's a little different. I look at things a little bit different. And it's probably because I grew up with a brother who was nonverbal. I had a lot of one-sided conversations. So, anybody? Oh, uh-oh. Well, I guess we're done. No, I don't know. Screen went black. We're finished. No, questions, and then I have my contact information. I also brought cards and all of that other fun stuff, but you want to snag this. If you have questions, or your therapists have questions, or you are in a school district that wants somebody to come do a lecture, I can do that as well. And then if you want a copy of these slides, go ahead and email. I will have my assistant send them over to you because it has the reference list on there.
Do you take CMS?
I do,
And do you go to the schools?
if they'll let me.